So here's slide number 2. Other things I learned at this time was that the model of argumentation that was being taught in those courses came out of a very distinctive intellectual tradition. Aristotle wrote, works that were important in all 3 of these traditions. And it's interesting just to take a quick look at that. So there is the logical tradition of argumentation that's captured in that's developed into formal logic, where the concern is about questions about, does this conclusion follow from these premises? And Aristotle had the first formal theory of valid inference in relation to reasoning about categorical claims. So that's a famous contribution, monumental contribution to the history of logic. But he also wrote about the practice of dialectical reasoning, where you've got people involved together exchanging ideas and trying to pursue a goal, resolving a dispute or coming to agreement. And that dialectical context was its own thing. So there were rules for doing that, well. You could think of that as a distinctive tradition of thinking about the nature of argumentation. And then there is this rhetorical tradition, where the model idea here is like the skill set that the speaker or the orator has to have if they're addressing a large auditorium, where they've got to try to persuade the group of some proposition or some claim or some course of action. And so the theme here is that these are principles for persuasive communication. Now, Aristotle, in this context, introduced what is now known as the rhetorical triangle. So logos, pathos, and ethos. Logic has everything to do with principles, for reasoning well in a formal way. Pathos having to do with evoking certain emotions within the audience that are important for the persuasive context. And then ethos has to do with the way in which your character as a speaker, how your audience perceives you in terms of an authority, your reliability, your trustworthiness, your expertise. Are you believable? Are you plausible to them? You can think of it simply in terms of, concerns about truth, concerns about reasoning, concerns about feelings and emotion, and concerns about trustworthiness and authority. And of course, in the real world, all of these are entangled. Real world argumentation is a messy mix of all of this. But the intellectual tradition treated them as separate, and largely still does. So the logical tradition is the tradition of symbolic reasoning and logic going back to the Greeks and then through the Middle Ages and on, and took off again in the 18th century, 19th century with the rise of modern formal logic, which was an explosion of work in that area, had almost nothing to do with the rhetorical tradition of reasoning about argument as a sort of species of persuasive speech. Dialectic has a history that's tied into both. In some cases, it has a foot in both doors there. In the real world, it's like this. And this is a reason to treat them as complementary skill sets. It was just a shame that when you study logic and critical thinking in a philosophy department in most places, you don't get any exposure to the tradition of rhetoric and the role of argumentation within that species, or argumentation studies, which are often taught in English department or departments of communication studies as opposed to philosophy. Am I saying anything here that's shockingly new to you guys?